Hello, welcome to section 4.6. The title of this section is Completing the Square. What we're going to do in this section is we're going to solve quadratics that don't work out nicely. You can't factor them, or something doesn't work out right, or you can't graph them. It's all about solving a quadratic when you can't factor it or you can't graph it. What do you do? How do you solve quadratics like that? So the first method, for example 1, is taking the square root. So we have 7x squared minus 10 is equal to 25. So we're going to solve this for x, and we're going to use regular algebra steps, just regular old natural algebra steps. And notice there's no x term. So there's an x squared and there's numbers, but there's no x. Remember, a quadratic in standard form is x squared plus bx plus c, but there's no x in this, and that's why the square root works. So normal algebra steps. Add 10 to each side. And there's multiplication that's happening between the 7 and the x squared, so I'm going to take care of that multiplication by dividing each side by 7. And I get x squared is equal to 5. 5 times 7 is 35. Then I take the square root of each side of the equation. And that's because the opposite of squaring is to take the square root. So I get x equals the square root of 5. But what we need to account for here is we need two solutions. And there's two numbers that make this true. Let's go off to the side here for a second. If we have x squared is equal to 25, there's two answers that make that true. There's 5 can be squared to make 25, or negative 5 can be squared to make 25. And that's the case here. You can square the square root of 5 to get 5, or you can do the negative version of it. So we add in plus or minus. So here's the solution to this one. And it's done by just taking the square root. So you add 10, divide by 7, just normal algebra steps. You're isolating the x squared, okay? But you're wondering maybe, hey, the title of this section is called Completing the Square, and I didn't do that. This is kind of like an aside, and the main part of this will be completing the square. So here's kind of a baby version of completing the square. This will be example 2. So they kind of ramp you up to the full thing in the book. So here's the baby version of it. 1449 equals 25. Each side of this equation is a perfect square. So we're solving for x. That's the instructions, is to solve for x. And that was the last one. So we're solving by taking the square root. So here we go. We are going to solve for x here. Each one of these is a perfect square. And you may not recognize it as a perfect square, but it really is. Each side of the equation is a perfect square. We know that 25 is a perfect square because 5 times 5 is 25, but this is a perfect square trinomial on the other side of the equation. So I write it down and factor it. So I get x and x, 7 and 7. And when there's a plus in the back, remember it's the signs double up, so it's 2 negatives. And that's a perfect square. It's the same thing times the same thing. So I get x minus 7 in parentheses, quantity squared is equal to 25. Then I can do the opposite, kind of like what I did on the last problem, and that's probably why they led us through this thing. We now are stuck in solving, so we're going to do the opposite of squaring, which would be to take the square root. So I take the square root of each side. So Squaring and square rooting are opposite. The x minus 7 falls out. And I still get the plus and minus business. So it's plus or minus the square root of 25 is 5, so it's plus or minus 5. We add the 7 over. We get x is equal to 7 plus or minus 5. Now, when it works out this easy, you really do need to come up with the two solutions. So this means two things, 7 plus 5 and 7 minus 5. So there's two answers, 12 and 2. All right, so x is equal to 12, x is equal to 2. So these two answers make the equation work. Let me go full screen here. So if I put 12 back in the original problem or 2 back in the original problem, it would be working out and make 25. So these are some of the problems in the book where they say, hey, each side of the equation is a perfect square. Factor it, take the square root, and then solve from there, and you should get two solutions. Okay, the next one is also kind of a preliminary step. This would be example 3, and this is where we get the name of the section. Complete the square. And it literally is a square. It's an algebra square, but it's a square. Anytime you have the same thing times the same thing, it's a square. So we're going to complete the square. X squared plus 6x plus something would make this a perfect square. So what you do is you have the 6 here. You take that 6 and you divide it by 2. And that's the b term. So you take the b term and you divide it by 2. You half that middle term, and then you square the result. That's how you complete the square. So half of 6 is 3, and then 3 squared is 9. So if I put 9 there, I have a perfect square. It really is a perfect square. So how did I do that again? I took 6, I divided it by 2, and then I took that answer and squared it. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So let's prove the fact that it actually is a perfect square. Perfect square, same thing times the same thing. So we go two sets of parentheses, x and x, 3 and 3. 3 times 3 is 9. And then if we add the 3 and 3 together, we get 6. And it is indeed a perfect square. X plus 3, quantity squared. It's the same thing times the same thing. So like the links to the side of the square. Okay, let's put all this process together. Let me check the time. How are we doing? 7 minutes. That's pretty good. Number 4, example 4. Go back to the blue pen here. Example 4 is x squared plus 10x plus 20 is equal to 0. All right. So here's the whole process of completing the square. We are going to complete the square. We're going to solve this by completing the square. This does not factor. I can try and factor it, but I can't multiply something to get 20 and then add or subtract it to get 10 in the middle. It just won't work. Okay? So I'm going to do the completing the square process. Step 1, prepare. Okay? So I prepare by leaving a blank space here. So I'm going to move the 20 over because I have to have a place to do the completing the square stuff. All right. So I'm going to go x squared plus 10x, leave a blank space, equals negative 20. So you see the blank space there? It's just like on the last one. Now I have to fill that up. So step 2, fill the blank space. The middle term, which is 10 in this case, divided by 2 and then squared. So half the middle term squared. So half of 5 is 10. I said it backwards, didn't I? Half of 10 is 5, and 5 times 5 is 25. So I'm adding in 25. Let me say that again since I said it backwards. You do half of 10, which is 5, and then you square the 5. 5 times 5 is 25. Now, to make this work, if I add 25 to one side of the equation, I have to add 25 to the other side of the equation. So I get x This is the third step. I got ahead of myself. So the third step is to factor, just kind of like we've been doing. And of course, 25 with the 25 with the negative 20 there would make 5. So we're going to add those together. That kind of makes sense to do that. And now I'm doing the factoring part. Well, I just kind of factored this like the last couple examples. So 25 with the 10x with the x squared is a perfect square. And I made it be a perfect square because I added 25 in there. So 5 and 5 and plus and plus. As everything's plus, it gets a plus. Okay, rewrite. X plus 5 quantity squared is equal to 5. There's lots of 5's in this. Okay, and then the step 4 is to solve. So I'm going to solve just like I did on the last problem, um, which would be the second problem right here, kind of to this step right here with the 7 business and the 25 there. I can just take the square root of each side and figure out the answers. Now in this problem, I got 12 and 2. I'm not going to get anything that nice on this guy here. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root of each side of the equation, and we get x plus 5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 5. And then I can get x by itself by subtracting the 5 over. And I get x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5. And there literally are two answers here. And the plus minus business just is like the math teacher's way, the math person's way of taking a shortcut. So the answer is x plus the square root of 5 and negative 5 and then minus the square root of 5. So one of them is plus the square root of 5, one of them is minus the square root of 5. And if you graph this on the calculator, you will see that this crosses at those two places. So let's take a second and do that. Let me see where I am with time. 12 minutes. Okay, we're good for time. So let's go ahead and do this on the calculator. I'm going to type this in. Let's see. I'm going to go back to the original problem. And I'm going to use this calculator because it's a little smaller and I can see what's behind it. Minimize this. So go whoops, turn it on. Y equals. And we're going to do x squared plus 10x plus 20. All right, and so I'm getting the solution without doing the whole, um, you know, the whole calculate and zero the function all business. I'm getting the actual answer here. Okay, so there it is, boom, and zoom standard, which is number 6. So you can see the two places where it crosses. So remember, trace will let you jump exactly to where you need to go. Okay, so I'm going to hit the trace key, and I'm going to do negative 5 plus the square root of 5. And that should jump me to one of the roots. See where it's blinking right there? And then that's where it crosses exactly. Now the decimal answer you can see is negative 2.7639 and change, right? Now let's do the other one. I'm already in the trace mode, so I hit negative 5 minus second square root 5. Close the parentheses, boom, it jumps me over to the other root. So I found those answers without using a calculator. And I'm showing you on the calculator that, yes, indeed, it crosses at those two places. Okay, the last example. Example 5. We have 2x squared minus x plus 3 is equal to x plus 9. All right. So to make this work, we have to prepare. So we got to leave a blank space, and we got to get the numbers on one side, leaving a blank space, and all that business. So are we ready? I'm going to subtract the 3 over because I need to leave a blank space. And I'm going to subtract x over because I need to get the x's on the same side. So it's 2x squared minus 2x blank space equals 6. 9 minus 3 is 6. Okay, now, the other part of completing the square is the first term here, x squared, has to be 1x squared. So you can't do completing the square unless it's a 1 in front. So that's the rest of the story, is this has to be a 1. So to make it a 1, I divide everything by 2. Okay, so 2 divided by 2 is 1, so there's a 1 there. If it helps you to write it there to think about it, there we go. Now we're going to involve fractions. Yay, fractions. So I have a 1. Okay, so I prepared. I have a blank space, and the first term is 1. Now the second step was to do half the middle term squared. So it's half of -1 divided by 2, and then squared. So I'm basically doing a half times a half. Well, 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. So I'm going to add 1/4 to each side of the equation. Okay, so this now factors, because that's the next step. So it's x and x. 1/4 came from 1/2 times 1/2, so that makes sense for it to be 1/2 and 1/2, and then minus and minus. And then over here, we would get 3 and 1/4. Now, this works better if it's an improper fraction instead of being a mixed number like it is right now. So I'm going to change it into an improper fraction. 3 times 4 is 12, plus the 1 on the top is 13/4. All right, rewrite. X minus 1/2 squared is equal to 13/4. I'm going to now take the square root of each side, just like I've been doing in the past. Square root, square root. We get x minus 1/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 13. And that doesn't have a square root, but 4 does. The square root of 4 is 2, so it becomes a square root of 13 over 2. Then I can add over, whoops, I can add over the 1/2 to each side of the equation, because ultimately you're trying to get x by itself. So you get x equals 1/2 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. There you go. Let's see that full screen. Ooh, you gotta love that. So what did I do? I prepared 2 ways. I left a blank spot right there, and this had to be 1. In order to do that, I had to shift things around. Then I took half the middle term, which was 1, and then I squared it. That was a 4th. I added a 4th to each side. That now is a perfect square, so it factors. It works better if it's an improper fraction, so I changed 3 and 1/4 to 13/4. I took the square root of each side, just like I've been doing, the plus minus, added the half over, and I got an answer. So there we go. That takes care of this section. So enjoy completing the square.